This online video lecture is about intelligence and general ability testing. So what is intelligence? I'd like to invite you to pause the video for a moment and just take a bit of time to write down your thoughts on your own definition of intelligence. What does intelligence mean to you? So there are varying definitions of intelligence, and we still don't have a full consensus on how it's fully defined. What we do know is that our own definition of intelligence shapes the way we view the world and the people in it. A common definition of intelligence is a measure of one's own ability to acquire and apply knowledge. And even though we don't have one single working definition of intelligence, across the board, researchers have found some commonalities to a lot of the definition. So these include elements of problem solving, factors related to verbal abilities, and social competence. And when we think of intelligence, we think of different types of intelligence, or we could also say knowledge, and the two main types that come up are crystallized, which is knowledge that comes from prior learning and past experiences. So an example of something that might test crystallized knowledge could be a vocabulary test or reading comprehension. And crystallized knowledge tends to increase with age. So it kind of makes sense. The older we get, the more experience we have, and the more learning and understanding we have, which is our crystallized knowledge. And then we have fluid type of knowledge. So this is being able to reason and think abstractly and also to solve problems. And so fluid knowledge, what we tend to see is that there's an increase in early and mid-adulthood, and it tends to decline later in adulthood. So some of the main common most widely used individual intelligence tests are the Wechsler scales. So this is going to be the most widely used overall out of all of the tests that I'll go over, and I'll go in this in somewhat of detail. The Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale, the Kaufman instruments, and the Woodcock-Johnson 3, which is a lesser used out of the four. So as far as the Wechsler scales go, there's three main Wechsler scales. There's the WAIS 4, the WISC 5, and the WIPSI 4. So the WAIS is for adults, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, it's the 4th edition, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, 5th edition, and the Wechsler Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence, 4th edition. So the Wechsler scales, they're all based on what we call a G factor of intelligence. And so this is a combination of both fluid and crystallized types of intelligence. And so the WISC for 5 is for ages 6 to 16 years old. And I have written here Class C because if you recall from the lecture when we were talking about ethics and who can administer what types of testing, this is the highest level of training that's needed. So there needs to be a lot of training in order to be able to administer either of these scales. And you can feel free to check out more information about the Wechsler scales on the website that's provided here, the pearsonclinical.com. And so the WISC, it's full scale IQ that's based on 5 index scores. And this consists of verbal comprehension, visual spatial, fluid reasoning, which we think of how well are they able to solve new problems, working memory, so we can think of memory tests for this, and processing speed, how fast are they able to solve certain types of problems. And so within verbal comprehension, the subtest, and you can read more about this in your text on page 177, but some of what it includes are tasks such as similarities, so the child reading words that are connected and they need to identify the connection, vocabulary, children are presented with pictures and verbal items and they have to name them, and for the verbal items, they may need to define the word that's read out loud. There's information and also comprehension. For the visual spatial subtests, there's block design, so the child may view a model or a picture that can be made with blocks provided, and then we see how long it takes him or her to complete the design. There's also visual puzzles, fluid reasoning, matrix reasoning, so the child may view an incomplete series or matrix and selects the response option that completes the matrix or series. There's figure weights, picture concepts, and arithmetic, which is some math, fluid reasoning. Then we have the working memory subtest. So there's digit span, where the child reads a series of numbers, which he or she must recall in the same order. There's picture span, which is similar but using pictures, letter number sequencing. And then for processing speed, there's coding. So it uses a key to copy symbols that correspond with simple geometric shapes or numbers. And then this is a time subtest. There's also symbol search and also cancellation. And so feel free to read more about these subtests on pages 177 to 179 of the text. And so for the WAIS, it has 10 core subtests. It's also testing similar items, but it's meant for ages 16 to 90 years old. And you can also read more about the WAIS on the Pearson website. So again, we're testing full-scale IQ. The tests are divided into sections, and then the subtests create a composite score. And the composite score creates the overall scale IQ. And then, so the separate sections are index scores. So we have verbal comprehension, vocabulary, similarities, information, comprehension. There's also perceptual reasoning here. We have the block design, as I mentioned in the child version of this, matrix reasoning, visual puzzle, figure weights. Then we also have working memory and as well processing speed. And so this test uses floor and ceiling levels. The intelligence floor is the lowest level of intelligence that the instrument measures, and the ceiling is the highest level of intelligence that the instrument measures. So it's based on these categories. And so here's just a visual of how the WAIS 4 is broken down. You can see the full scale IQ here is made up of both verbal and performance. Within verbal, we have verbal comprehension and working memory, and you can see some examples of what those are in the bottom left. And then within performance, we have perceptual organization and processing speed. And then each of those are composed of certain tasks. So all of this comes together for the full scale IQ. And here's how the WAIS for the scoring looks. So if we're looking at in the genius range, if you've heard that before, or very superior is greater than or equal to 130, that's the standard score. And 19 is the age standard score. So that would be a very superior score if we were seeing 19 for age standard score or 130 for standard score. Superior, 120 to 129, standard score, age standard score 16 to 18. And you can review this yourself, but we can see kind of average goes here from, it's supposed to be 90 to 109, and 9 to 12 for the age standard score. And then severe deficits, or moderate deficits rather, are going to be less than 69. So we tend to think about there being impairment around the score of 70. So the Stanford Binet Intelligence Test, this is for use with individuals 2 to 85. It also has a full scale IQ, and it has verbal IQ and nonverbal IQ subsections. This is also a Class C instrument, which means that it requires extensive training. And there's 5 factors for both verbal and nonverbal areas. So with the Stanford Binet, we have fluid reasoning, knowledge, we can think of that as similar to comprehension, quantitative reasoning, math and problem solving using numbers, visual spatial processing, which we've went over. That's really how well are people able to use vision and physical manipulation combined to solve problems. And then working memory, so memory tests. And this is the breakdown for Stanford Binet. We can see the GIQ there broken into verbal and nonverbal. And then again, the 5 nonverbal subtests and the 5 verbal subtests that we just went over. So we can think of this as a 5-factor index that has 2 subtests each. The Kaufman instruments, these are utilized a little bit lesser than the first 2 that I mentioned, but we have the Kaufman Assessment Battery for children, ages 3 to 18. This has 18 subtests. Kaufman Adolescence and Adult Intelligence Test, again, not as widely used as Wechsler instruments. This is ages 11 to 85. And here, this test integrates different theoretical approaches from learning theory. And something interesting about the Kaufman Adolescent and Adult Intelligence Test is that the subtests are presented in both auditory and visual formats. And feel free to read more about this in your text. The Woodcock-Johnson 4, I'm not going to go too into detail about this because it's not very widely used right now, but it's comprised of 3 instruments that test cognitive abilities, achievement, and also oral language. And here's also some additional individual instruments that you can feel free to look up on your own if you're interested in gathering some more information. Differential ability scales, Slauson intelligence test, Raven standard progressive matrices, Peabody picture vocabulary test, and test of nonverbal intelligence. But above all, the Wechsler scales are going to be the most widely used. So those were individual intelligence tests. We also have group intelligence testing. And this is given more often than individual intelligence tests. It's usually given in schools. A factor to think about with group intelligence testing is that it's not as easy to monitor the test taker's behavior during the assessment, which can really inform some of the outcomes. You might just think for yourself for a moment, why would it be important to monitor the test taker's behavior? What type of information could you get from that? And so group intelligence testing require more reading than individual tests. And again, you need to consider other factors of individuals, such as culture, background, language proficiency when you're interpreting the results. And we need to be doing this with individual testing as well. These are some examples of group intelligence testing: the cognitive abilities test, Otis Lennon School Ability Test, InView, and multidimensional aptitude battery. So these are some examples of the tests that you might see. The multidimensional aptitude battery, it's actually not designed for use in schools. It's designed as a convenient alternative for the WAIS. And so it's either for adolescents or adults, and it can actually be given individually or in groups. And there's 5 verbal and 5 performance subtests on this one. So what are some of the problems with intelligence testing? And again, I'd like to invite you to pause the video for a moment and write down 3 thoughts that you have on what are the problems with intelligence testing. So is intelligence stable? Infants and young children have the least stable intelligence scores. That's something that we see from the research. Early research actually indicated intelligence gradually declines after age 20, but this is not supported. And as we know, there's been a big movement in the field of something called neuroplasticity, which shows that our brains are continuing to change and we are able to acquire and add new knowledge much beyond the age of 20. And so, again, more recent research is indicating that intelligence gradually increases from childhood to middle age and then levels off. And the declines, as I mentioned previously, tend to occur in the areas of fluid intelligence. So, what does that mean about crystallized intelligence? So, crystallized intelligence tends to stay and even increase. And the degree of decline really relates to interaction of variables such as physical health, mental activities, and education. So, some issues in intelligence testing, what do the scores predict? They appear to be related to academic performance. So there's a correlation of zero point 0.5, which we know is not that zero point 0.7 that we're looking for, or zero point 0.8, but there is some correlation. And we know that the relationships among IQ scores, occupational success, and income, they're not simple. There's many factors. And there is some difficulty with generalizing validity of some of these intelligence scores. So there is a huge controversial issue in intelligence testing. In fact, one of the most controversial issues, which is intelligence hereditary? And so it's really difficult to determine estimates of genetic contribution of intelligence despite efforts made by researchers. And heritability indexes for intelligence tend to be approximately zero point 0.5. And so we know that both genetic and environmental factors affect intellectual development. And IQ scores are seemingly related to the interaction between the two. So, what are some of the environmental factors that influence intelligence? Culture, school attendance and quality of schooling, of course, family environment, environmental factors. These are just some of the factors that influence intelligence. And some issues that come up around these, such as the achievement gap for certain populations that you'll read a bit about in your reading this week. So, are there group or cultural differences in intelligence? Just on the note of gender, there's some research to support that men may be better at visual spatial tasks, women may have more skills at some verbal tasks. As far as ethnic groups go, African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans tend to score lower on intelligence tests than European Americans or Asian Americans. And some of the reading is going to cover a bit of this, but some of these differences may be due to socioeconomic, linguistic, cultural factors. Why else do you think that there could be some gap in between these groups? So this is also the Flynn effect, which is something to just know about. James Flynn, he was the first to identify a steadily increasing intelligence test scores in recent years. And some possible explanations are from test sophistication, changes in education and educational opportunity, and changes in parenting practices. And so there have been differences, for instance, in certain generations, there's been gaps to say that intelligence is on the rise. And these are some of the possible explanations for the Flynn effect.